Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, you're able to see the screen and everything, no?
Ma'am.
Okay. So I think whoever joins, let them join in between. We'll just start it.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Uh, so today actually we'll be discussing one of very important topics in neonatology, which is kind of a little neglected topic because it is mostly encountered in your PNC boards more than in your proper ICU management. But it is more important to know about it because we have to know which are the patients with antenatally diagnosed hydronephrosis who actually require more proper monitoring and who can actually turn out to be a severe postnatal hydronephrosis as well. So we'll be seeing it, discussing the entire hydronephrosis, but there will be particular parameters in which we will be discussing today. So let's start it off. Just a second, someone is entering, I think. Okay. So we'll begin the talk. So obviously the basics that we know, that kidneys are majorly responsible for excretion and also for maintaining the fluid, the electrolyte and the pH balance in the body. Now hydronephrosis by itself, by the definition of hydronephrosis, it is a pathological process which characterized by distension of the renal pelvis, renal calyces, and this will be because of the stagnation or reflux of the urine. Now, hydronephrosis, hydroureter, all these are different terminologies, but it is basically a single pathology can actually lead to all of these. Uh, Someone's speaker is on, no? That's why it's, yeah. So, what we know is that the ultrasound screening which is done during pregnancy has been responsible for diagnosing a lot of cases of fetal hydronephrosis. Now, there is a difference in the definition and the grading system for fetal hydronephrosis and the postnatal hydronephrosis, which we will be discussing now. Now, if the pregnancies are properly monitored, then around 1% of fetal uropathies are detected in these ultrasounds. Among them, more than 50% are hydronephrosis. So that is the incidence of hydronephrosis that we see in fetal life. Now, what happens to it later on? Yeah. So we'll be just brushing through this slide. We are not going to discuss the embryology of kidney, but what we need to know is that nephrogenesis, that is the origin of the kidney, it starts around 4th week of gestation and it ends by around 36 weeks of gestation. And throughout the process, it has successive phases. So we have initially the pronephros, then mesonephros, and metanephros. Now, metanephros is your final, is the final thing which is going to lead to your uh, postnatal and the adult kidney. The active phase of nephrogenesis, however, takes place between the 28th and the 36th week of gestation. So, what happens whenever there is a nephrogenesis and everything happening simultaneously inside the kidneys? There is a different atmosphere in the urogenital region as compared to the newborn baby's urogenital tract. Now, there are some physiological variations which lead to fetal hydronephrosis. So, not every fetal hydronephrosis is going to be pathological in its origin. Now, what are the basic differences? This is important to know because then we know why we are looking at conservative management for most of our cases of fetal hydronephrosis. So, the differences basically are that there is a very low renal vascular resistance in the antenatal period. Also, there is a relatively high renal blood flow. There is a higher GFR, there is a low renal concentrating capacity. So the overall response is that there is a relatively high urine volume which goes on in the fetal life. Along with that, the other thing is that the compliance of the ureter also increase in the fetal life. So because of this, even the ureters are easier to expand. So there is already a relatively high urine volume along with expansible ureters. So because of this, there will be some degree of hydronephrosis in the fetal life universally. Also, because the fetal and the neonatal kidneys are not completely developed, And the ultrasound examination also may actually have a false positive diagnosis of hydronephrosis in this time period. Now this is one of the consensus statement which was given by the SFU, that is the Society of Fetal Urology. They have given us the differential diagnosis of the antenatally detected hydronephrosis. So as you can see, around 40 to 80% of the cases of fetal hydronephrosis are actually transient. So these could be that physiological process which we already talked about in our previous slide. The other causes, the pathological variants which will be causing hydronephrosis in our fetus will be, one is pelviureteric junction obstruction, what we call as PUJ obstruction. These are seen in around 10 to 30% of the cases. There could be a vesico-ureteric reflux in around 10 to 20% of the cases again. There could be a junctional obstruction at the vesico-ureteric junction. The kidneys may be having anatomical some congenital anomalies of the kidneys like dysplastic kidneys, duplex kidneys. So all these have roughly around 10% of all the cases of the fetal hydronephrosis. Again, posterior urethral valves in 1 to 2%, and as we know, it is more common in the male child. And there are some other uncommon causes as well. So as you can see, the majority of the cases of antenatally detected hydronephrosis are transient and most probably physiologic in origin. So to completely look at all the possible reasons why there would be a hydronephrosis, that is the other way that we are describing it as an upper urinary tract dilatation. So if it is along with hydroureter, then you can have a completely urinary tract dilatation as well. So the basic pathophysiology will be, one is obstruction, as we saw all the PUJ obstruction, your posterior urethral valves, your obstruction at the uretero-vesical junction. The other cause could be vesico-ureteric reflux. Then the diuretic phenomenon, which we have already discussed, or there could be a spontaneous or an operative resolution of some developmental anomaly, like a kink in the ureter, while the formation is already going on. Once it spontaneously resolves, it can appear to be a hydroureter, or a hydronephrosis could be seen because of that. So the basic reason why we are even discussing the pathophysiology is for all of us to understand that hydronephrosis does not necessarily mean obstruction. There are other reasons as well. So it is not synonymous to obstruction, and we have to keep that in mind. And so as you can see, the lower three reasons are also the pathophysiologic reasons for your hydronephrosis. Now these are certain embryological timing which roughly we need to know. So we know, we have already discussed nephrogenesis, and basically the GOT formation starts from the 4th weeks, go on till 36th weeks. The urine formation starts roughly around 8 to 10 weeks of gestational age. Now when we look at the ultrasound milestones, the bladder can become visible from the 8 to 10 weeks of gestational age. Kidneys can be detected at the same time like a properly formed kidney, but the origin starts before 8th week, but ultrasound detection is by roughly more than 10 weeks. And we can have the filling and emptying cycles which are seen around 15th week. So the bladder visibility will be depending on this. What is most important is that the ureters, the renal pelvis, and the renal calyces should not be normally visualized in an antenatal ultrasound. So if they are visualized to whatever extent, then that is a pathologic state. Now when we talk about antenatal hydronephrosis, there are a few headings under which we have to discuss it. So what we need to know is how should the antenatal monitoring go. Like we have already diagnosed hydronephrosis, right? So how do we monitor the hydronephrosis? Then which are the babies in which we will go for fetal interventions? If the fetal interventions are not needed and the antenatal hydronephrosis baby is delivered, how do we monitor this baby postnatally? What about micturating cystourethrogram? Which are the candidates in which we do this test? Where do we go for diuretic renography? Who are the candidates for antibiotic prophylaxis? and which are the candidates for surgical interventions. So all these headings, like roughly these 7 headings, is what we need to know when we are looking at fetal hydronephrosis. Now we will be discussing it one by one. So now let's start with the antenatal monitoring of antenatally diagnosed hydronephrosis. Now, before monitoring, we need to diagnose it antenatally. So, once antenatal hydronephrosis is diagnosed, we need to know the severity of it. The severity is based on the AP diameter of the renal pelvis. That this is the anterior-posterior diameter of the renal pelvis. So, anytime we are looking at a hydronephrosis kind of state in a fetal ultrasound, we need to know the AP diameter, what it is, so that we have a rough estimate about the monitoring process further on. Now, the most important line in this entire presentation is that the diagnosis of a fetal antenatal hydronephrosis will be that AP diameter more than 4 millimeter in the second trimester, and the AP diameter of the fetal kidneys of more than 7 mm in the third trimester. Now we need to remember this throughout the presentation, because this is the first and the most important thing that I need you to take away from this presentation. Now the hydronephrosis, once we know that more than 4 mm in the second trimester and more than 7 mm in third trimester is diagnostic, then we have to grade it further. Now for defining the hydronephrosis, we use lower cutoffs. So that the sensitivity is higher, but it definitely reduces the specificity and we can miss many of the cases. Now there have been multiple meta-analysis in all those 7 parameters which I showed you right now. There was a meta-analysis in 2006 which found that the risk of postnatal pathology increases with the degree of the antenatal pelvic dilatation. So this is the reason why we need to know whether my fetal hydronephrosis is a mild, moderate or a severe variant. Because as we know that the postnatal pathology risk will be 11.9% in mild cases, 45.1% in the moderate cases, and around 88.3% for severe cases of hydronephrosis. So accordingly, we can stratify and decide which babies need more postnatal monitoring. Now moving further, we have to grade it as the mild, moderate and the severe degree of fetal hydronephrosis. So as we have already seen that 4 and 7 is our cutoffs. So the mild will be 4 to 6 mm of AP diameter in the second trimester, and in the third trimester it will be 7 to 9. For moderate, we'll have 7 to 10, and in the third trimester it will be 10 to 15. And for the severe cases, the definition says more than 10 mm in the second trimester and more than 15 mm in the third trimester. Now what generally you need to know is that for diagnosis, we want the AP diameter more than 4 in the second trimester. So for 4 to 6 becomes mild, 7 to 10 becomes moderate, and more than 10 becomes severe in the second trimester scan. In a third trimester baby, any AP diameter more than 7 is diagnostic of fetal hydronephrosis. So we will have a mild pathology if it is 7 to 9 mm, moderate pathology for 10 to 15 mm, and any AP diameter more than 15 is a severe hydronephrosis definition. Now we know that even the fetuses with any minimal pelvic dilatation will have some risk of postnatal pathology. But what is more remarkable is that any AP diameter of more than 15 in any of the trimesters talks about a very severe hydronephrosis. It requires close monitoring, and this may be the case where we might even require fetal interventions. Now, once we have seen the grading of hydronephrosis in the antenatal period, we also need to see whether it is unilateral or it is bilateral. We'll be seeing why that is important. So, in unilateral cases, how do we monitor the child? Is that once we have a second trimester scan of unilateral hydronephrosis, we require at least a third trimester single scan. So, 2 scans should be enough, and after that, once the baby is born, we will do the postnatal evaluation. However, when we are dealing with a child having bilateral hydronephrosis, more frequent monitoring may be required. Roughly, the recommendation says around 4 to 6 weekly scans would be good. depending on how severe the hydronephrosis is and if there is any oligohydramnios. So oligohydramnios is one of the very important and dangerous signs in the wake of fetal hydronephrosis, because that talks that the renal functions are compromised a lot and there is no enough fetal urine production, or maybe there is an obstruction which will be detrimental. The other reason why oligohydramnios babies are more at risk is that we know that the fetal lung development depends on the amniotic fluid volume. So your severe oligohydramnios can actually lead to the babies having pulmonary hypoplasia. So we don't want this. So these babies we will be requiring very frequent scanning, around 4 to 6 weekly, and if needed, fetal interventions may be taken in these babies. Also, irrespective of whatever is the antenatal course of the child, a postnatal evaluation is definitely needed in these babies. Now moving on, when we are looking at an antenatal hydronephrosis in a scan done at the second trimester, that is roughly around 16 to 20 weeks, the anomaly scan can detect antenatal hydronephrosis. At the same time, a detailed evaluation of the lower urinary tract to look for obstruction is required. We also have to look at renal dysplasia. We have to look at any extrarenal malformations are there. If the child is syndromic, if there is a prune belly kind of association which is seen in this child. Now, the ominous signs which can tell you on ultrasound that there is a possibility of a severe lower urinary tract obstruction are that generally the hydronephrosis in this case will be bilateral. Secondly, as we have already discussed, there could be oligohydramnios and many of the times severe oligohydramnios. And the third thing is that the bladder wall can be thick and the bladder may be dilated. So, obviously, when we are talking about the lower urinary tract obstruction, what we are talking about are PU valves. So, whenever there are different PU valves, there will be an obstruction right at the urethral level, because of which there will be retention of urine secondary to the obstruction. This will lead to your dilated bladder and the thick-walled bladder. Also, progressively it will lead to bilateral hydronephrosis, and because of the severe obstruction at this level, there is going to be oligohydramnios. So that gives you an idea why these three parameters have to be looked in the ultrasound, because they tell us about a lower urinary tract obstruction. And most of the times, a very severe lower urinary tract obstruction may require a fetal intervention in terms of the valve ablation, which will have to be done in the fetal period itself. The other poor prognostic signs that we look for are dilated posterior urethra, then any urinoma. If there is a progressive dilatation of the ischial system, or there is a ureteric dilatation coming in, or there are other features suggestive of renal dysplasia. Now, there have been multiple studies which have looked at the possibility of hydronephrosis and their severity in aneuploidy fetuses, but the likelihood is very low. That is why every fetal hydronephrosis, a karyotyping is not warranted. Okay. So the good news is that almost 80% of our fetuses who are diagnosed with hydronephrosis in their second trimester do show resolution or improvement. If there is persistent hydronephrosis in the third trimester or a worsening hydronephrosis, that is linked to higher rates of postnatal pathology, and these babies will require a still closer watch. Now, there have been multiple studies which have shown that 88% cases of mild hydronephrosis have completely resolved in utero or in the immediate neonatal period. So these are that's why a postnatal ultrasound scan to look at the neonatal hydronephrosis is important, to make sure whether the resolution has completed or is it persistent or worsening. However, what is also seen is that with the cases of moderate to severe hydronephrosis in the third trimester, around 1 in 3 neonates have required a postnatal surgery. Now, although the study which has talked about surgical requirement in 1 in 3, that is around more than 30% of the neonates, was quite an old study, we have newer guidelines right now. But the gist of this is that there is a severe postnatal hydronephrosis in these babies as well. Now, already we discussed that fetuses with the signs of lower urinary tract obstruction, and especially someone who is coming to us with a severe oligohydramnios will require frequent monitoring, and maybe interventions may be needed in these babies. So this is a prenatal monitoring algorithm which we already discussed. Now we will be revising this at the end of our talk again. So as we can see, in antenatal hydronephrosis can be unilateral or bilateral. It could be mild, moderate or severe, and it could be with any other systemic malformations or without systemic malformations. If we see there is a severe oligohydramnios, severe hydronephrosis, any other malformations, the baby has to be referred to a specialized center where fetal interventions can be taken place. Now, when there are unilateral hydronephrosis or it is mild, then a third trimester scan is more than enough, and after that we check the baby postnatally and ultrasound is done at 3 to 7 days of life. If there is bilateral hydronephrosis or there is a severe, moderate to severe hydronephrosis, then in this case we may need a serial antenatal ultrasound. As we had discussed, 4 to 6 weekly ultrasound may be needed, and we will be looking at the progression or the regression of hydronephrosis in the baby. And if everything goes well, then a postnatal ultrasound again at 3 to 7 days of life or earlier if it is indicated will be needed. So we have seen the antenatal monitoring. Now, coming on to the fetal interventions, there are certain fetal interventions which are reserved for very severe cases. Now, generally the interventions are recommended for severe oligohydramnios or in the babies whom we are suspecting severe lower urinary tract obstruction or where the renal function compromise may be high on cards. Now, in any of the severe cases of isolated hydronephrosis, there is no recommendation for pregnancy termination anywhere. However, there may be some life-threatening complications in the other systems, which may actually which may warrant termination, but not isolated hydronephrosis. Now, before any of the therapeutic interventions are taking place, what we need to see is a fetal vesicosynthesis, because this will give us an idea about the urine electrolytes, the beta 2 microglobulins in the urine osmolality in the fetal life. And this will give us an idea about the maturity as well as the function of the fetal kidneys. So, I have just used this, but there's no need to like completely remember the values. But what is seen is that the fetuses who are most likely to benefit from any of the therapeutic interventions are going to be the ones in which these parameters are coming positive. That is, we have decreasing levels of fetal urine sodium, urine calcium, urine osmolality, or maybe decreasing levels of fetal urine protein or beta 2. Actually, it's microglobulin, not macroglobulin, because these are the babies in which the renal function is severely compromised, and we have to consider fetal intervention very urgently. Now, as we have discussed that the most predominant causes for lower urinary tract obstruction in male fetuses is your posterior urethral valve. So in these cases, what we can offer them is an vesicoamniotic shunting. So here we are completely shunting off the obstruction place, and because of the shunting, the urine production and the amniotic fluid volume, everything improve. The other option that we do have is a in utero endoscopic ablation of the valves, but vesicoamniotic shunting is more commonly done. Now, the therapeutic interventions preferably have the best outcomes if done in the second trimester. However, most of the interventions are done in the third trimester, depending on what was the time period when the severity was diagnosed and how bad is the severity of oligohydramnios. There are several studies which say that these fetal interventions do improve perinatal survival in the fetuses with severe obstruction. However, long-term renal outcomes or mortality reduction is not that evident in all of these studies. One second. Yeah. Now, moving on to the third part of the talk, it will be postnatal monitoring. Now, what is most important to take away from this entire talk is how do we diagnose, how do we grade your antenatal hydronephrosis, and how do we monitor in the antenatal period. And when do we start on the diagnosis of a postnatal hydronephrosis, and what is the monitoring schedule? The rest of the things vary as per patient to patient requirement, but these two are the most important things that you will need to know. Now, when we talk about postnatal monitoring, the first question is, when do you do a first ultrasound in this baby? Now, normally a first postnatal ultrasound examination has to be done within the first week of life. That is roughly in 3 to 7 days of life, or at least before the hospital discharge. So in all the mild cases and in the cases of unilateral hydronephrosis, we follow the same dictum that the first postnatal ultrasound at roughly 5 to 7 days of life, what we do it. Whenever we have a severe bilateral hydronephrosis, and wherever we have a very high suspicion of the posterior urethral valve or the lower urinary tract obstruction, as we talked about, so the first scan has to be done within 24 to 48 hours, because these babies may require interventions that early in life, and we cannot allow the baby to remain like that for 5 to 7 days. Now, what is the reason why we don't prefer to do it in 24 to 48 hours for every baby who is born? Because the ultrasound in the first few days of life will always underestimate the degree of pelvic dilatation, because there will be dehydration in these days, and there will be a relatively low urine output as compared to the fetal urine output period. So because of this, it is always recommended that there should be some delay in doing the first ultrasound. Now, there have been studies which suggest that the risk of postnatal pathology is around 10 to 11% in infants with a normal postnatal ultrasound also. So, as against to 54% in which there is a persisting hydronephrosis. So a single postnatal ultrasound done in the first week of life, if it is negative, it doesn't mean that your baby is completely risk-free. Generally, most of the recommendations, they still say that even if the first ultrasound in the first week of life comes negative, you still repeat one ultrasound at 4 to 6 weeks, because there is still a chance of around 10.8% of these babies having some degree of postnatal pathology. And there is a negative predictive value of a normal postnatal ultrasound of around 98.9. This was for UTI. This was initially very, very important when we were talking a lot about antenatal, when we were talking about antibiotic prophylaxis a lot. But right now we have a conservative approach on that too. So now, because we know that the postnatal ultrasound, is it showing hydronephrosis or not showing hydronephrosis? So similar to our antenatal diagnosis and monitoring, we also need to know what is the definition of your postnatal hydronephrosis, and what is the severity of your postnatal hydronephrosis. Now, for this, we use two parameters. One is the AP diameter of the renal pelvis. Again, obviously the definitions are different. And the other is a classification which is given by the SFU, that is the Society of Fetal Urology. Now, this is the severity grading as per the SFU. So what you can see is, here we are not just using the AP diameter. What we are seeing is the sinus part. So if the urine is barely splitting the sinus, what we can say, it is a SFU grade 1. On the other hand, if the pelvis is full and even the major calyces have started to dilate, we are dealing with an SFU of grade 2. As against this, when the pathology is worsening, we have a uniformly dilated minor calyces along with the major, which we had seen here. However, if you can notice, the parenchyma is completely spared. This is your SFU grade 3 for neonatal hydronephrosis. Once the parenchyma is involved and there is a parenchymal compromise, we are dealing with severe, the most severe form of neonatal hydronephrosis, which is your SFU grade 4. So as we can see, it is not just the AP diameter, but we are also looking at the renal pelvic fullness. We are looking at the dilatation of major and the minor calyces, as well as the cortical thickening, that is the parenchymal compromise. So what you can remember is, whenever we are talking about SFUs, the grade 1 and 2 are found to be mild variations. However, the grade 3 and 4 are the severe degrees of neonatal hydronephrosis. So once your minor calyces, your major calyces and parenchyma all are involved, that is the severe most form of postnatal hydronephrosis. When the same things are compared to your AP diameter, what is a rough guideline is that any AP diameter less than 10 millimeter in the postnatal period corresponds to your SFU grade 1 and 2. And any AP diameter which is going more than 10 mm is correlates with your SFU grade 3 and 4. Guys, if you have any doubt, do tell me, because I know these are this look like unrelated things. This actually goes on and on, but at the end of it, we do have one algorithm coming in. So this algorithm will actually put all these things in a single perspective. Right now, just I have highlighted all the red parts which you are seeing are the main take-home things that you need to understand from this particular slides. So we have seen the severity grading. So as per this, the neonatal hydronephrosis is basically defined as any SFU which is more than grade 1 or any renal AP diameter which is more than 7 millimeters. Now, as I said, 7 to 10 mm corresponds to your SFU grade 1 and 2, and more than 10 mm AP diameter is actually talking about your SFU grade 3 and 4, that is the severe degree of neonatal hydronephrosis. Now, there have been meta-analysis which do suggest that isolated antenatal hydronephrosis was 5 times more likely to stabilize if it was associated with a postnatal SFU grade 1 or 2. As against to a postnatal SFU grade 3 and 4, because this is the severe degree of the neonatal hydronephrosis and do require some or the other interventions later on. Also, the SFU grade 3 and 4 were found to be associated with higher odds for surgery. Now, postnatal ultrasound, once we are doing and we are finding that there is a severe degree of hydronephrosis, we should also be looking for the calaceal, the ureteric dilatation per se, if there is any cyst, if the, what is the echogenicity of the entire the kidney echogenicity, then are there any bladder wall abnormalities, is there any obvious ureterocele, or what is the bladder emptying, because now we'll be able to decide what are the further investigations and what are the therapeutic managements that we want to do for this baby. Yeah. So this was how we diagnose the postnatal hydronephrosis. Now, how do we follow up this child? So any neonate with antenatal hydronephrosis and a normal first week ultrasound should definitely have a repeat study at 4 to 6 weeks of life. Even if it is a mild variation, even if the hydronephrosis has completely resolved in your first postnatal study, we require 2 studies which says that there is no postnatal hydronephrosis in this child. Now, in infants with isolated mild unilateral or bilateral hydronephrosis, as we said, SFU grade 1 or 2, or your AP diameter less than 10, should be followed up by one sequential ultrasound at 4 to 6 weeks of life to look for progression or whether there is a resolution. And if there is no resolution, no progression, and it is static, then what we do is that we do follow up ultrasound studies. Normally till 2 years of age, it is said that we can do, actually it is now recommended that we do one study after 3 months, one study 6 months later, and after that we can do it yearly till that entire resolution is found. But most of the infants, the hydronephrosis resolution do occur before 2 years of life. Now, infants who have SFU grade 3 or 4, or the AP diameter is more than 10 mm, which is our definition for your moderate to severe hydronephrosis, they require closer follow-up. So one ultrasound will be definitely done at 4 to 6 weeks of life, because it is more sensitive as well as specific for obstruction than the first week ultrasound, because we have seen the reasons for it. So this was the postnatal monitoring. Now we talk about micturating cystourethrogram. But before going on to that, we'll just see one of the postnatal algorithms. So this algorithm looks very busy slide, but what you need to know is right now, don't focus on that entire part. What you focus is only on the top part. So we have done a postnatal ultrasound. The initial scan we had done in the first week of life. We do a repeat scan at around 4 to 6 weeks of life, which we have seen. Okay, so in our repeat scan, we can have 3 possibilities. Either the child will have no hydronephrosis, or there could be some mild hydronephrosis but without any ureteric dilatation, or the child can have a moderate to severe hydronephrosis or a mild hydronephrosis with ureteric dilatation. So what we need to understand is, if there is no hydronephrosis in 2 postnatal ultrasounds, no further interventions, no further investigations are needed. If our child has mild hydronephrosis but there is no ureter dilatation, here we do the ultrasounds as we already discussed, and we do the ultrasound till there is a complete resolution which we find on the uh, neonatal ultrasound. So here we stop. Now comes the next part where we have this third possibility, that we are dealing with a child with whom we have done 2 scans, a first week scan and a 4 to 6 week scan, and we have these findings that there is either a moderate to severe hydronephrosis or there is a mild hydronephrosis with ureteric dilatation. Now these are the places where your next things come into picture, that is your micturating cystourethrogram, then your diuretic rhinography, your prophylactic antibiotics, and your surgical interventions. So don't focus on that part. We'll be seeing this slide again later on. Now, which are the kids who warrant a micturating cystourethrogram? But before that, what exactly is micturating cystourethrogram? So, micturating cystourethrogram is nothing but a voiding cystourethrogram. We know MCU. So, this is a dynamic test. So, what it demonstrates is the lower urinary tract, entire tract is demonstrated, and if there is any chance of obstruction, it is found early. Also, it helps to detect any vesico-ureteric reflux as well. It looks as a bladder pathology. It looks at any of the congenital or acquired anomalies of the bladder outflow tract. Here, the most common one, as we discussed, is the posterior urethral valves. There could be a urethrocoel. Even renal tumors or some cyst in the bladder are not very common, but there is a small possibility always. Now, the procedure for doing an MCU is that a catheter is passed through the urethra in the bladder. In the bladder, the contrast material is filled, and then the radiographs are taken when the patient voids. So, the commonly used dye is a urographin, which is diluted with normal saline. Now, how much is the dye to be used and all, we are not going into details of that. But what we need to know is that basically the age of the child and the weight of the child determines how much dye is used in the MCU. Now the radiographs which are done in this are in 4 phases. One is a scout film, which is basically our film which is prior to even the dye insertion. So after putting your catheter, you do this X-ray. The second is a filling film, that is while you put the contrast in. Then there is a voiding film while the urine voiding is happening, and there is a post void film which looks at if there is any remnant urine in the bladder. So now further on, whatever are the different investigation strategies or the management strategies that we'll be discussing in this entire talk, we'll be taking it as question based. So on whom to perform, why to perform, when to perform, and so on and so forth. So coming on to the MCU, which are the candidates in which we will be doing MCU? Now, as we had already seen in our algorithm also, any child who is coming to you with unilateral or bilateral hydronephrosis, which is grade 3 or 4. That is, we are talking about moderate to severe hydronephrosis. If it is detected in your 4 to 6 weekly scan, then we do a MCU, or if there is any ureteric dilatation. The other indication is that the infants who had mild grades of hydronephrosis to begin with in the first week, but there is a progressive worsening of the hydronephrosis, or there is a progressively thinning of the parenchyma. So these are the candidates in whom we will be again doing an MCU. The third thing is that whenever any infant who had antenatally detected hydronephrosis develops a urinary tract infection, we have to be immediately ready to do an MCU, because this is giving us a very high possibility of vesico-ureteric reflux in this case. So we need an MCU to rule it out. Now, when do we perform MCU? So in patients with very severely suspected lower urinary tract obstruction, and the ones in whom we do our ultrasound in first 24 to 48 hours, if the findings are there, we do an MCU within 24 to 72 hours. Now the outcomes are not very good with this, but because interventions may be needed, that is why it is done. But most of the time we don't do MCU here, we do the scans, we do the renography directly. In all the other indicated cases, as we already know that we have done a second ultrasound at 4 to 6 weeks, so our MCU will be immediately after that. Now, why do we perform a MCU? So the two things that we need to know, first is already discussed, the lower urinary tract obstruction, like in your posterior urethral valves. So if we diagnose it and if we treat it initially, then the risk of progressive kidney disease, the risk of recurrent UTIs, pyelonephritis will be brought down. So for prompt interventions, and early MCU is needed. The second reason why we do it is that around 8 to 38% population with antenatally diagnosed hydronephrosis have the risk of vesico-ureteric reflux. This is as compared to less than 1% in our general population. So as you can see, the risk of VUR is way higher in the antenatally hydronephrotic babies. And if we are doing an early diagnosis of severe VUR, we can start off with the antibiotic therapy early, and if any surgical interventions are required, even that can be done. So no further sequelae will occur. Now this you can see there are the gradings of VUR. What we are most worried about is your grade 4 and grade 5. Generally, whenever we start off with the prophylactic antibiotics also, we are mostly dealing with your grade 4 and 5. So this is your MCU picture showing a grade 4. Yeah, grade 4 to 5 actually of vesico-ureteric reflux. So this was about a micturating cystourethrogram. So the major thing that we are trying to achieve through an MCU is to look at whether there is a presence of reflux or an absence of reflux. Now if the reflux is present, then we will be managing it. Now what happens if we have a severe hydronephrosis but our MCU says that there is no reflux? But we also do not find any obstructive cause obviously staring at us in the face. So this is where you go for a diuretic renography. Everyone is with me till this stage, right? Guys?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
If there is any doubt about the last phono, just ask me right now. Okay, because the diuretic renography is going to be a topic in itself. Okay, if there is any confusion, I'm open to questions even right now. Nothing? Okay, good. So let's go to diuretic renography. So again, I'll revise that whenever we do an MCU, we are looking at a vesico-ureteric reflux. If there is no reflux present, if there is no obvious obstruction that we have found till now, and even if there is some degree of obstruction that we found, we are going to do a diuretic renography, because this will give us the structural as well as the functional idea about the kidney. And for any operative interventions as well, we need to have this picture clear in our head before that. So now, what exactly is a diuretic renography? We are not going to go into a lot of details about this, because if luck favors, in the coming 1 to 2 weeks, we may be having a talk on renography per se by one of our nuclear medicine consultants who has been uh, really big hearted about it. So we may be looking at a session on it within the next 1 to 2 weeks. But today what we need to understand is the basics of what exactly are we talking about when we do a renography scan. Now renography is the medical imaging of the kidney, where we are using radioisotopes. The common ones which are used in the neonatal and infant age group is the technetium labeled ones, technetium 99 ones, and these are later on viewed with a gamma camera. These are also known as your radioisotope renography, renal scintigraphy, or a nuclear renography. If you remember the last talk that we had on a direct jaundice, we had talked about HIDA scan, which was a hepatic scintigraphy. So here we are dealing with renal scintigraphies. Now, whenever we are using diuretic during this scintigraphy study, what we call it is a diuretic renography. So we'll be seeing what are the places where we use diuretics. Now, the common radiopharmaceutical materials which are used in these cases are your technetium labeled MAC3, that is your mercaptoacetyl triglycine. You have your DTPA, which is again a diethylene triamino pentaacetic acid, and your ethyl cysteine as well. But for practical purposes, it is okay if we remember it as a MAC3, a DTPA, and an EC scan. There are a lot of other materials, but this we are focusing on what we use more in our infant and newborn age groups. Now, how exactly does a renography work? The major prerequisites which we require is to ensure that our baby is hydrated. Most of the times, oral hydration is more than enough. Bladder catheterization as a routine procedure is not needed except when there is a patient with suspected bladder abnormality, or in kids in whom you are seeing that there is persistent contrast in the bladder in your post maturation films. Here we may electively decide to catheterize our baby. What is done is basically a radionuclide material, that is our tracer, which we already discussed the names of. It is injected into the IV system. Now this compound will be usually located or it will be excreted by specific organs. So in this case we are talking about our kidneys, so our compound is going to get localized in our kidneys. Now this radionucleotides, they contain the radioactive atoms. So when these atoms are going to decay, they emit gamma rays, and we have a specific machines which are equipped to detect this gamma rays. So there is a gamma camera and these rays will be detected. So accordingly we'll be getting a renography picture. So this is the basic idea about what this study entailed. So, now you must have heard about different scans. There is something called a DMSA scan, DTPA scan, MAC3 scan. So exactly what are all of them the same scans? Then why do we take different names? So what we basically need to remember is that the various types of radioisotopes which are employed in the nuclear renography, there are three distinct types, and depending on what is the area of the kidney that we are interested in looking at, we'll be using that particular scan. So the first and the commonest one, the commonest agents which are used are our DTPA and MAC3. So basically this MAC3 and DTPA, the technetium labeled ones, these are filtered through your glomerulus. So whenever we are looking at measuring our perfusion, whenever we are looking at our renal functions like measurement of our GFR, or we are looking at an upper urinary tract obstruction like say your PUJ obstruction, what we need is to do a DTPA or a MAC3 scan. Now, MAC3 scan technically is safer than your DTPA scan. DTPA scan cannot be done in babies in whom you have already a compromised kidney. The only reason why it is very commonly done is first thing is that it is relatively inexpensive, so it is easier to be, and it is very easy to be done and available. So these are the scans. The second type of isotopes which are available are your excreted agents. So these are the agents which will be seen in the renal tubules. So whenever we want to evaluate a tubular function, or we are looking at the transplant, the post-renal transplant cases, we'll be using these excreted agents for the scan. MAC3 is a filtered as well as an excreted agent. There is the EC scan can be done. There is a hippurate which is also used. Then the third one which we have is our cortical imaging agents. Now the cortical imaging agent, which are commonly are glucoheptonate and your DMSAs, these are accumulated in the cortex of the kidney. So whenever we are evaluating the renal parenchyma, specifically whenever we are looking for renal scarring, for any differential renal mass or any infarction of the kidney parenchyma, we'll be using our cortical imaging agents. So in our baby, if we have, like say going by whatever we have discussed, if we have a baby who was antenatally diagnosed with a severe hydronephrosis, say your AP diameter around 12, or say 15 in the third trimester, we did a postnatal ultrasound which again reconfirms the finding that there is a severe hydronephrosis, SFU grade 3. Then we did a repeat scan at 4 to 6 weeks of life. There we again confirmed that there is a persistent hydronephrosis which is still grade 3 or 4, that is the severe class. We did our MCU. Our MCU showed that there is no reflux. Okay, so in this case, the next step will be to do a renography. So obviously, when we are talking about doing a renography in this kind of scenario, what we want to look at is our glomerular function. We want to look at whether there is an obvious obstruction somewhere. So here, obviously, we'll be using our DTPA or the MAC3 scan. So this is how you decide that which patient requires which type of agent for your renography. However, if this was an older child in whom there is a vesicoureteric reflux which was already seen, now there have been multiple episodes of UTI, we are worried about whether there is any renal scarring present in the child, what I'll be going for is your DMSE scan. So it's that way. Or for that matter, even in a neonate or an infant in whom we are looking at the renal parenchyma, we'll be going for the DMSE scan. So this is the basic idea of what types of scan have to be done whenever we are dealing with the postnatal hydronephrotic child. Now, when do we call the renography as a diuretic renography? Now, this is important because not every kid is going to require diuresis, but most of them do require it. So, what does diuretic scan mean is that we give your IV furosemide, which is around 1 mg per kg, around 15 minutes after the radionuclide injection is given. There have been a few studies which have also looked at giving it like 15 minutes prior. So both of the uh, techniques of giving your Lasix or furosemide are right. The only thing is that always remember that once you give a furosemide either earlier or later, if this child is warranting a second diuretic renography scan, just you have to make sure that the timing of giving your diuretic is same. Now, if there is a obvious complete obstruction, then it is detected even without your diuretic agents. Now, when we are dealing with a partial obstruction, generally what happens is that our isotope removal is not that good, but once we give our diuretic agent, then the urine flow increases, and because of this, the partial obstruction which was present will be demonstrated better. So these are the partially obstructed cases where your diuretic scan will be required. Now, when we talk about a renogram, it will be always checked in three panels. We'll be looking at the perfusion of the kidneys, we'll be looking at the drainage, we'll be looking at the function, and there are curves and analysis. We are not going into details of that because, as I said, it's way out of my intellectual area as well. But what is important is that the function of the kidney, when it is checked with the renal scans, we also look at the comparative function of the two kidneys, and we'll see why that is important later on. Now, to cover all the bases of the renography, we'll be just advantages and disadvantages of will show us the structure, it will show us the size and shape of the kidney as well as the GFR as well. It will also help us in differentiating whether it is a passive dilatation causing hydronephrosis or there is an obvious obstruction. Depending on the use of a diuretic agent, we can differentiate if there is a partial obstruction also. And very important and as well because it looks at vascularity. Now, the disadvantage of doing a renography is obviously we have a radioactive agent that is being images which are produced have the low contrast as compared to your X-ray, CT, MRI. So many times, even if there is a diagnosis, we may have to go on to do an even an MRI urography is a very upcoming thing because it gives a proper delineation of the anatomic structures. So it gives a good idea for the surgeon who is going to operate in that area. And our renography do not provide us that. Also, it is time consuming, generally around 1 to 2 hours is what we look at, and it cannot differentiate between cysts and tumors. So now that we know everything about what exactly is the entity of renography, who are the babies who will be doing. So this obviously we have discussed it again and again that any child with moderate to severe hydronephrosis whose MCU was done and there was absent vesicoureteric reflux will be doing a renography. Any child who had mild hydronephrosis but dilated ureters and again the MCU shows there is absent vesicoureteric reflux will be doing and patients with vesico-irritable pre-PUJ obstruction and a VUR. So in these cases, we will definitely be looking at a renography to look at the PUJ obstruction as well. Now coming on to when do you perform a renography? So preferable time is 6 to 8 weeks of life, because as we know that this is a isotope study. If there is a severe hydronephrosis, severe cortical thinning, and as we had already discussed, there are very few rare selective cases where even an MCU can be done in the first week of life. So in these cases, we can perform an early diuretic renography. In some of the patients whom a renography has been done, there may be a repeat renography would be needed later on if there is any worsening of the pelvic alveolar dilatation on your ultrasound. In this case, the timing is not defined, but generally it is at 3 to 4 weeks at least after the first scan. And at this time, as we had discussed, the timing of the diuretic administration and which tracer was used in the first evaluation should be similar whenever there are serial evaluations which are done. Now, the interpretation of diuretic renography is something that I personally have been sitting for the last 10 hours and still no idea about it. But there are a few clues to interpretation of this study which we do need to know. So a normal renogram will have an early peak, that is there will be a 2 to 5 minutes early peak, there will be a descending phase, and then there will be a renal emptying. So what we are looking at is that the isotope is suddenly taken up in the early 2 to 5 minutes, then it is rapidly descending, and then the complete emptying will take around 20 minutes. So if there is a satisfactory drainage which occurs spontaneously, or maybe a drainage which occurs after the diuretic administration, it actually rules out our obstruction. The other thing that we got from our renal scan is about a differential renal function estimation. Now, differential renal function is basically your right kidney and your left kidney. How much percent is each kidney contributing? So, a normal differential renal estimation is anywhere between 45 to 55%, which roughly, in a rough general term, says that both of the kidneys are 50-50%. Any value of any one of the kidneys which is going less than 40% is definitely significant. Now, a very interesting thing is also that they have found that there is a entity called a supranormal differential renal function. That is, if one of the kidney has a supranormal value, say it is more than 55%, again that is pathological, because that may say that the opposite kidney is not functioning that well. And this is very important because this will help us to determine whether we need a surgical intervention for our kid or whether the child can be managed conservatively. The other parameters also which are checked is what is the time required for clearance of 50% of the radionucleotide, that is the T half. If it is more than 20, that says that we are dealing with some degree of obstruction somewhere. Now, I think that is all about your diuretic renography. I have tried quite a lot to simplify it as much as I could. If there is any doubt, I think with the next session, we can clear all that doubts with the person who is actually specialized in doing these scans. Now, the last two things that we need to discuss in case of your postnatal hydronephrosis now is who are the patients in whom antibiotic prophylaxis are given and which are the patients in which we need surgical intervention. Now, antibiotic prophylaxis is a very confusing thing which has been happening now. If you see the total number of studies which have been performed regarding your antibiotic prophylaxis in patients with your hydronephrosis, here we are talking about your vesico-ureteric reflux per se, because your obstructive cases generally do not require antibiotic prophylaxis. So when you are talking about antenatal prophylaxis in your reflux kids, you'll find around 50% studies which are supporting it and 50% of them which are negating it. In fact, most of the recommendations which are given do use the line saying that most of the recommendations are experience based and not really evidence based. So I've tried my level best to still come on to some degree of middle ground. Now, in prophylactic antibiotics, pardon, someone has any doubt or something? Okay. Yeah. So when we are talking about a prophylactic antibiotic therapy, why do we even need to start it? Now, there have been a lot of studies which says that infants with antenatal hydronephrosis, even in whom we have the hydronephrosis which has postnatally resolved, have still increased risk of UTI. Now, the risk of UTI will obviously depend on how much is the duration of hydronephrosis and what was the severity of the hydronephrosis, as well as if there was any prophylactic antibiotic given. But a lot of newer evidence suggests that most of the cases of isolated mild hydronephrosis uh, without any prophylaxis have similar frequency to UTI in unilateral as well as bilateral cases. Basically, what we are trying to say is that there are equal evidences for supporting as well as equal evidences for negating your prophylactic antibiotic therapy. Now, but one thing is sure that we have a lot of evidence supporting the fact that infants with postnatal renal AP diameter more than 10, which as we have discussed corresponds to your SFU of grade 3 and 4, have significantly increased risk of infections as compared to the mild ones or those with no hydronephrosis. And a lot of them are in the context of your vesico-ureteric reflux. Now, this is the same thing which I already discussed, that where does exactly the evidence stand, and because we need to have some degree of a middle ground. So in 2009, uh, the American Urological Association had updated that they recommended the use of continuous antibiotic prophylaxis in the population for the first year of life. Now, wherever I have highlighted with red are the studies which negate the idea of using prophylactic antibodies. So they do say that CAP, that is your continuous antibiotic prophylaxis, do not reduce the risk of UTI, but in fact there is a high incidence of antibiotic resistance bacterial infections in these patients. And everywhere wherever the guideline have recommended, they are generally your grade C or grade D recommendations. I'll not go into entire detail of what the different evidences do stand for, but I have given you a list down. So if anyone is interested, you can go and read those studies in details. Now, there is a randomized controlled trial, which was a very big trial running for around 5 years, which has been recently published in our NEJM, that is the New England Journal of Medicine. This is known as the RIVER trial. It is one of the few trials which actually did an RCT on a multi-institute scale. Now, what they did was they compared placebo as compared to your antibiotics prophylaxis, and they found that among the children with vesico-ureteric reflux after UTI, like most of the kids who were diagnosed with VUR were after the first episode of febrile UTI. In these patients, the antimicrobial prophylaxis was found to be associated with a substantial reduced risk of recurrence. But even they have not seen any long-term benefit, and there was no association of renal scarring with the antibiotic prophylaxis. Now, whatever are the evidences which are discouraging the use of long-term prophylactic antibodies have their own reasons. Now, the first reason is that because of the prophylactic antibiotics, there is a high incidence of resistance of antibiotics. In fact, studies have shown that in the subgroup of people who received the prophylactic antibiotics, when they got a urinary tract infection, this infection was actually related to a resistant organism. So there was a definite incidence of antibiotic resistance. Then these patients showed no evidence of any renal scarring or long-term sequel prevention. Most of the study designs itself are heterogenic, so we can't come on to a really standard consensus about it. And again, it is a cumbersome daily dosing. So initially, whenever the prophylactic antibiotic therapy had started and it was in a completely big scale going on, the antibiotics used to go on for the child for around 5-7 years of life, and this is a daily dose of antibiotic. So most of the studies which have shown positive impact of the antibiotic prophylaxis also have reported a non-compliance rate of more than 25%. So daily dosing for multiple years in itself is not a practical option. So none of the studies actually justified giving long-term antibiotic prophylaxis, which was done in the past. And in fact, it is said that managing simple factors like constipation was far better in preventing your urinary tract infection. Now, if anyone is interested, I have given the link of the RIVER trial. It's actually a very good study to read. So, which are the patients who start this prophylactic antibiotic? First of all, patients with postnatally confirmed moderate to severe hydronephrosis who are still in that evaluation process, we do start off with antibiotics. Then infants with postnatally confirmed hydronephrosis with ureteric dilatation, again, who are awaiting evaluation. So we are talking about prophylactic antibiotics, but not on a long duration scale. However, starting your antibiotic prophylaxis in cases of vesicoureteric reflux, which has been a norm so far, is now questionable because as we saw about the evidences. So what do we practically do for it? We'll be discussing. Prophylactic antibiotics are not required in children with any obstruction like your PUJ obstruction or your posterior urethral valves. In these patients, the post-surgical period antibiotics can be given, or the prophylaxis may be justified in cases of neurogenic bladder in patients who are on regular catheterization, but not really as per the pathology of obstruction. Now, when it comes to a vesicoureteric reflux, whether we give antibiotic prophylaxis or we don't give prophylaxis, there is no specific evidence-based recommendations available. However, there is a beautiful book talking about the rational antibiotic practices in pediatrics, which is given by the IAP specialty series, which has cleared the confusion on a big scale. So for right now, for any practical purposes, for our local Indian settings, prophylaxis can be offered to the infants with a vesicoureteric reflux, as the risk of UTI is higher in this age group. So we are looking at age group of less than 1 year, and most of our investigations are not yet complete. So again, as we had talked, whenever the investigations are still ongoing, it's a safer option to continue the antibiotic prophylaxis. However, even in this kind of setting, beyond 1 year of age, the prophylaxis should not continue for more than 6 months after the last urinary tract infection. Also, at the same time, it is better to counsel the parents about the signs and the possible symptoms of a UTI, and early diagnosis and early starting of the therapeutic antibiotics is recommended more than giving a unlimited supply of your prophylactic antibodies. Also, once the child starts getting older, the diagnosis of urinary tract infection becomes easier in the child. Diagnosing in terms of your clinical presentation as well as your urine analysis becomes easier. So, in fact, prophylaxis is not needed here. We can give therapeutic doses of antibiotics whenever it is indicated. So, when we have discussed all this, what are the antibiotics that we talk of? Now, in the first 3 months of life, generally the preferred ones are cephalosporin. So your oral cephalexin in the dose of 15 milligram per kg per day daily is the antibiotic of choice. In a few cases, amoxicillin can also be used. Post 3 months of age, however, we prefer to give oral cotrimoxazole more than even the nitrofurantoin. The dose will be around 1 to 2, but commonly what we use is a 2 milligram per kg per day daily dose of cotrimoxazole. If oral nitrofurantoin is given, then it will be in the dose of 1 to 2 milligram per kg per day, again daily. And we have already discussed how long it should be given. So this is all about your prophylactic antibiotics. Now we come on to the final stage, which is our surgical interventions. So when is it that we look at doing surgery in cases of our postnatal hydronephrosis? So whom do we operate? So any infant with a proven lower urinary tract obstruction, any infant with obstructed hydronephrosis and the differential renal functioning is reducing, or there is a worsening of the functions on the repeat evaluation, says that the obstruction is actually causing the renal deterioration, so we need to operate urgently. And any child who has bilateral hydronephrosis, or there is a hydronephrosis in the solitary kidney with a with worsening of the functioning of the kidneys. So roughly this is known as around a reduction of the differential function by 5 to 10% on renography is when we think about urgent surgical interventions. Other than these three causes, the other cause will be recurrent UTI, any large hydronephrosis where the child is getting recurrently pain or discomfort, or any palpable renal lump, we would consider surgical management. Now, why do we need to operate this child? What if there is hydronephrosis which is worsening, but the child looks comfortable to you and there is no UTI? Then why do we still need to operate? Because here we are worried about long-term renal functions. So we want to prevent loss of renal functions. We want to reduce the degree of hydronephrosis and the symptoms which we talked about. And the renal pelvis evacuation, once it is improving and the hydronephrosis gets resolved, the renal function by itself will be improving. So we don't want our kid to land up in a CKD like situation later on. So we'll be a little proactive about the surgical management in these patients. Now we have decided that we want to do a surgery. Now what surgery do we do? Whenever we are dealing with something like your posterior urethral wall, the step-by-step approaches that first of all has to be an early urethral catheterization for maintaining the patency. The which in this babies have to be corrected. The differential function is less than 40. So I'll be telling you about why the 40 figure is so important. In these cases, pyeloplasty is the modality of choice. It can be done either laparoscopically or whatever is the place of obstruction, as you can see in this figure, will be removed, and there will be a directly pyeloplasty procedure done, and the patency will be again started. So whom not to operate, this is something, in fact, better than saying whom not to operate, we can see whom to manage conservatively. Now, any infant who has a differential renal function of more than 40% can be managed conservatively. This has been proven by a lot of studies. Some of the studies even talk about a differential function whenever it goes less than 35. So 35 to 40 is the range beyond which if the function drops, then they operate. But for all practical purposes, renal function, whenever it is dropping below 40%, or if there is a change by say 5 to 10% in the subsequent scans, we talk about surgery. Till then, we can monitor the child, we can have close follow-up, serial USG monitoring, and the child can be conservatively managed. Here we may be requiring your antibiotic prophylaxis as and when if we have a child who has recurrent UTIs as well. So this is where we end our talk on our antenatal hydronephrosis. So instead of saying a take-home message for this entire talk, what we'll be looking at is the algorithms. Okay, so for the algorithms, the first algorithm which we had already seen in the beginning of the talk was the prenatal monitoring. So in prenatal monitoring, we know that we have a fetus diagnosed with antenatal hydronephrosis. So it could be three possibilities. It could be a unilateral mild hydronephrosis. In this case, we'll be doing an ultrasound in the third trimester again. If everything is fine, we'll just do a postnatal ultrasound at 3 to 7 days of life. If we are looking at bilateral or severe hydronephrosis and none of the other features which we had looked at, like the severe oligohydramnios or see your bladder thickening, and none of the other ultrasound indications which prompt us for fetal interventions, then we'll just be looking at the child ultrasound every 4 to 6 weekly, and if everything seems okay, then the next management, whenever we have a fetus with multiple systemic malformations along with the hydronephrosis, it's a good idea to refer to a specialized center, because here the fetal interventions can be considered after having a one-to-one counseling with the parents. Now moving on to the post postnatal evaluation algorithm, the one which we had discussed, and now everything will fall in place because postnatal ultrasound, we know the first scan will be done in the first week of life, roughly 3 to 7 days. A repeat scan has to be done for every case at 4 to 6 weeks of life. There are three possibilities. The first one is that there is no hydronephrosis on both the postnatal ultrasound scans. That is, the SFU was grade 0, AP diameter of the renal pelvis was less than 7 mm. The other possibility is that there is a mild hydronephrosis, but there is no ureteric dilatation. And the third possibility is either the hydronephrosis in itself is moderate to severe, or the second thing is that the mild hydronephrosis could be along with a ureteric dilatation. So the approach for all these three will be different. So whenever there is no hydronephrosis, in 2 postnatal scans, there are no interventions which are needed. And this baby, we don't do any investigations and no interventions. Whenever we are dealing with a mild hydronephrosis and no ureteric dilatation, we repeat an ultrasound. So the next ultrasound will be after 3 months. After that, it will be post 6 months, and after that, yearly till the entire resolution has taken place. Now, when we go on to the severe form, that is the moderate to severe hydronephrosis or the ureteric dilatation variant, the first thing that you do is a micturating cystourethrogram, which is done at 4 to 6 weeks of life. There are three possibilities which you can get after doing an MCU. Either there will be a vesico-ureteric reflux present. In this case, you give the antibiotic prophylaxis. We have already discussed the duration of the prophylaxis as well. The other possibility is that we find a lower urinary tract obstruction already in the MCU. Here we directly go on to the surgical intervention if there is an obvious scan. But most of the times, as I already said, that even after you get an obstruction, you do a renography because the functionality of the kidneys have to be checked before we go on to a surgical intervention. Now, what if there is no obvious urinary tract obstruction and no obvious vesico-ureteric reflux? So in these cases, we'll be going for a diuretic renography, again around 6 to 8 weeks of life. So there are two possibilities. Either we find that there is no obstructions and the kidneys are functioning well. In this case, we go on to our monitoring schedule. If there is an obstruction which we find, then we have to go on to the surgical intervention. And surgery will be as far as what we have discussed, that the conservative management will be if the obstruction is not a complete obstruction or a severe obstruction, and whenever the differential function of the kidneys is more than 40, that time we conservatively manage, otherwise surgery is required. So that is your entire pathway and the entire algorithm for your postnatally diagnosed anti-hydronephrosis. So I think we should, our major reason of knowing this entire thing is that we don't want our kidney to say that you are failing. We in fact want our kids to have lovely kidneys and a lovely life. So thank you guys. We are stopping our talk here. Yeah. Should I end it?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Sure.